research. It's actually organizing. I began working with the New Jersey Work Environment Council last year. Prior to that, I worked in Paterson Public Schools in one of our over 100-year-old buildings. So we've had personal experiences with indoor air quality and other issues that come with building age, maintenance, etc. We work with the New Jersey Work Environment Council in our district, along with many other education associations. Healthy Schools Now's mission is to make sure that all New Jersey students and educators learn and work in a safe, modernized building, free of hazards. So that's a big thing. And it does take community, and that's a thing that I've heard so far with the panels, that it takes all of us, all of our brains, all the research, all of the organizing, and listening to all of the needs.
Thanks, Nikki. So my name is Alan Barkume. I'm an industrial hygienist working with the Work Environment Council, and the majority of the work that I do now with the Work Environment Council is with the New Jersey Education Association, advocating for the health and safety of all the NJEA members, which then, our kind of rationale behind that is if schools are a huge part of a community, they're like one of the few public things that we have left sometimes, it seems like. I mean, that's where I got vaccinated. I don't know about you, but it was in a public school. But anyway, so working with the public schools is a way of helping to enhance community health, environmental health. That's just an introduction. I think maybe I'll pass it on just to make sure everybody's introduced, and then I have something that I brought just one slide to kind of have something to talk about up here that I could get into after Memo introduces himself too. Sure.
Thanks, Owen, and thanks everyone for being here and for the invitation. Thanks, Gary. My name is Memo Cedeno. I'm a faculty at the Rutgers School of Public Health, a faculty at the OC. I'm privileged to be colleague with many of the researchers here, and also collaborator with some of the community members that make our work worth. My background is as a mechanical engineer. I was trained as a mechanical engineer in Mexico. I then followed that path in energy engineering. I did a master's in Germany. And all of a sudden I realized that it wasn't through engineering that I was gonna really do the change that I wanted. And I pivoted to public health. And for the past 10 years or so, my research has focused on indoor environments, indoor environmental quality, how the experience that we have in the places where we live, where we work, where we do most of our activities influence our health, our well-being. The case of the schools is particularly interesting to me. First of all, there's a saying in the indoor air quality field that we only force people to be in two places. One is prisons and the other is schools. So we better do a good job in the quality that we provide in these spaces. The other was because of COVID, right? So if you remember, back then, I don't know how many years ago now, but we could have probably managed to reorganize our society if we work from home and do many other places. The thing that really changed everything is when we sent kids to home, right? So that's the importance of schools in our society. So they play such an important role. And we figured out, because of previous research that my colleagues and I did, that we knew that schools were, just as one of the items of importance, they were, for the most part, very poorly ventilated, right? So that's when we had a virus that transmitted mostly through air, that we said, unfortunately, we have to send everyone home. So schools was pivotal in this decision. Later on, as we realized this, I think everyone, including the White House, put a lot of emphasis on how to change this situation, right? And last thing I would say is, schools have lots of challenges. We're gonna discuss them here, hopefully. But I think overall those challenges, we have to recognize that nothing deserves more attention than our kids, right? So we always, I think, say kind of bragging that the children are the future. I would say they are the present, and they are the most valuable thing we have, right? So imagine all the money that goes into the infrastructure of our bridges, our data centers, our universities later on, but really kids is the most important piece in society. So I think despite all the overwhelming amount of challenges, we should focus on making these places as healthy as possible.
Okay, I'm just going to mention what I have written on this slide back here. I didn't realize that you had mechanical engineering as the original background. So maybe give some insight into just something that I want to mention here. So I'm not a researcher, at the university, although I did part of Rutgers NIEHS kind of historical tour that they do across the country for occupational health education. But so my what I'm going to bring here today comes from experience, what I'll just call the real-world experience of working in a bunch of public schools in New Jersey, especially during the pandemic. And especially right now, because I hear this thing that there's this model indoor air quality plan that has been devised and kind of put together by a lot of folks, Johns Hopkins and everything. So I just want to kind of go through this flow chart real quick from the top to the bottom of how we want things to happen and then how they really happen, and maybe kind of point to some solutions that could help not just indoor air quality in schools, but overall environmental health. So the idea is that we have standards for indoor air quality. At least, we have, well, I'll talk about the ASHRAE standard, which I didn't even write the term up there, but this is the standard that's used if you're going to have a building that's mechanically ventilated. The machines that push the air around have to fit the ASHRAE standards. The key thing that you have to recognize here, maybe not you in this room, but as anybody that's interested in the policies underlying this, is that these standards are design standards. And what that means is the day before you open the building, the mechanical ventilation system has to meet said standard. The day after you open the building, there is no standard. And that's something that's really important to recognize to answer the question in the back about how often should I change the filters in my HVAC system. There is no standard for that. It's determined by the manufacturer of the unit and what it's doing. So big point here, the standard does not cover us. It does not protect us after you turn the building on. Essentially it doesn't. I mean, it's supposed to, but it doesn't. And one of the reasons is because things don't work the way they were designed a lot of times, especially if they were designed and installed, 60 years ago. And we're relying on actual people, maintenance workers, to identify problems and to repair problems in those systems. And so, I just have on a flow chart here about how do you know after you turn the building on, how do you know whether it's doing what it's supposed to? Is the air filtering particles from outside? Could be wildfires, or general pollution outside. Is it diluting the indoor air enough that any contaminants that make it inside or are generated inside are diluted enough that we're not getting a high enough concentration to have adverse health effects? Are our systems working well enough to do that? Well, if you don't know, we don't know. And one thing we learned during the pandemic was, no, they're not. A lot of places that we went, no, they're not doing what we're supposed to. I think one of the most relieving things maybe that I heard during the pandemic was somebody say, you know, what should we do? You know, what kind of standards should we be shooting for in these places to get? And somebody said, just make sure the buildings are doing what they were supposed to be doing when we opened them 20 years ago. Let's start there, because there's a lot of buildings that aren't even there yet. And so then some of the solutions that we were kind of coming up with, seeing be implemented or you know, thrown around as ideas was, one, commissioning. And somebody brought this up. It's a very expensive thing to do, especially in a public school where you get either one person or a bunch of people that walk around with an air flow meter at every single vent and then cross-cancel all the numbers and see whether the system is doing what it's supposed to. It's pushing too much air in this room and not enough in that room. You know, that's one thing you can do. That costs a lot of money to do. That's not going to happen across every school in New Jersey, or in your own house, or maybe in your office building, not in a public school. Another thing that came up a lot, which is happening regardless, are sensors. There are some schools that have these more advanced systems that have CO2 sensors in them, and then the HVAC system will, you know, go up or down with its dilution ventilation based on how many people are in the room and exhaling. It's just a proxy for how many people are in there. A quick example is some of those sensors are not being looked at by people in the building or people that control the systems in the building. They're being looked at by people that are working for a company that's maybe in Texas or something. And we did a walkthrough in a building once and we said, you know, this unit doesn't look like the outdoor air vent isn't even open. And they said, oh, we can check that right now through our computer and our system. And we looked at it and they said, yeah, it says it's open. You know, our thing on this, my computer screen says that we're standing in front of the unit and it's not open. So there's a disconnect there. So commissioning is really expensive. Sensors kind of break sometimes. So the only two things we have left are the maintenance workers in the building who know this equipment and know how to fix it, but also the occupants in the building. And in this case, I don't want to talk about students as occupants, as the ones giving feedback in this case, but teachers, secretaries, and people who work in the building, those occupants can give really valuable feedback about what's working and what's not. Sometimes better than the maintenance staff because there's only one maintenance staff for the entire building. And so my initial thing is why indoor air quality education? One of the big things that we do is, or at least did during the pandemic and continue to do, is train NJEA members who aren't just teachers, but you know, anybody that works in a school, of what is indoor air quality, what are the problems that you can get, what are the bad parts about it, what can we do to fix it, what can we do to identify when something's not working right, how does this system work, how do you know whether it works or not, and that way you know what to say when you go ask somebody, hey, I don't think my ventilation is working properly. If you're an educated occupant, you can give good feedback. But a non-educated occupant, when I talk to somebody who doesn't know anything about indoor air quality, it's hard for me to help them because they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what is a problem and what's not. So I just say, you know, education about this stuff is really important. One of the things that, you know, that we do through Healthy Schools Now and Work Environment Council, working with the NJEA, is educating the occupants, really the workers in the public schools. And then one last thing I got to say is about maintenance workers' rights, because those are the people that are doing the work. And you know, we can talk about things like privatization and this and that, and how those things are not good for what we're trying to do, which is have people someone whose job it is to work in a building and identify problems with the HVAC system and correct those problems. You know, identifying a source of problems instead of just band-aiding things all the time. The more rights the maintenance workers have, the more likely they're going to be able to hold on to their jobs, they're going to like their jobs, they're going to do a better job. And so those are just the two things that I at least wanted to mention, and then I'll pass it on and happy to take questions too.
All of the issues that Alan has brought forth in memo as well are challenges. So we look at what are the problems in schools. So as a layperson who actually worked in a classroom in an older building, We saw all of the gross things that you've seen in slides prior, but before you eat, we didn't bring slides of this. But imagine, you have pests like rodents, we had a closet when we went on vacation and came back, we had seen that in our mini closet, we had pest infestation, a rodent infestation, roaches, and we noticed that our particular rodents that we named Mickey and Minnie, like blue paper, blue construction paper. So we couldn't keep our construction paper for our students to use for their projects. We couldn't keep our writing paper because they particularly liked that. And it wasn't that our building didn't have a pest management system. It's just that the building was old. You couldn't, they lived inside the cracks and crevices, and basically they're Band-Aid issues. A lot of our parents don't know this. A lot of folks who don't frequent the schools can't know this. We have leaks, these are just general maintenance problems, but they're exacerbated by age of buildings. And where we come in as organizers is advocating for legislation that would help enforce these issues, staff shortages. I found out that some contracts with private companies, they don't allow the workers to come in and clean certain things. So you're thinking that your surface is going to be clean and everything's going to be safe. No, and that's usually left to the educators in the classroom, which we're technically not supposed to do. We're not supposed to clean unless we're trained, but that's not what really goes on. You want to make sure your space is well prepared. Sometimes the custodian, like Alan mentioned, there's only 1 or 2 per building. We had up to 400 students in our building, and this is not even our largest building. And this is just one example of buildings across the state. So we have 31 districts that are considered former AVID districts, but they're called Schools Development Authority districts, which through the Education Law Center won a lawsuit saying that these 31 districts are the highest need districts that deserve fully funding for new buildings, for maintenance, and for thorough and efficient education for all of its students. And we know that today, even though the 31 districts are still the highest need districts, we have districts that are considered regular operating districts and new types of schools and buildings that are facing the same issues. And I talk with educators in Cape May, they have constant mold issues because they're near the water. I mean, there's so many issues. So then I guess we go into what are solutions.
I don't know if you want to reply to that before I have a couple of things to say.
That's representative, what Nikki brought up is representative of any old, major city in New Jersey and a lot of the smaller districts as well. And then I'll also mention just that down in South Jersey, it's not just a moisture problem, it's a saltwater problem too, which changes, that corrodes components of your HVAC system in different ways also, which puts a lot more pressure on it. We are in one of the most people in here might know this, we're in one of the most difficult places in the world to condition properly for indoor space. So it puts a lot of pressure, I guess is something you could speak to, puts a lot of pressure on the mechanical systems to maintain a healthy environment indoors, which also means that they're more likely to malfunction, and when they malfunction, they can create a way worse environment than they would have if they weren't even there, because a lot of times you don't know that they're not working. And that's when we have the big problem, and I get to like educating the occupants and the workers' rights of the people whose job it is to identify whether these things are working or not. I'll pass it on.
So I would say, sadly, this is like a generalized situation, I would say, for most of the US. I really like that you started with the standards, right? So how do we design and operate these places? And I really think that the organizers of this event they had a reason for putting schools as a separate entity, right? So if you think about buildings, just the infrastructure per se, these problems are pretty well identified. The root cause is lack of funding, right? So if you don't invest in these buildings, they degrade, and we come to these issues. But there's even a more fundamental problem from my perspective, or a couple of them. The first one is precisely referring to standards. So the standards that you were talking about, people think there are standards that are designed to protect human health, right? And I'm going to just talk about two of them. One is the ASHRAE Standard 55. ASHRAE stands for the American Society of Heating and Ventilation and the guys in refrigeration, right? So these guys are responsible for providing fresh air and comfortable temperatures. So 55, ASHRAE Standard 55, tells you a range of temperatures that most of the people, 80%, that's the aim, 80% of the people to feel neutral, not happy about their environment, just neutral, and they fail. The other standard, very important, is ASHRAE Standard 62. And ASHRAE Standard 62 says minimum ventilation for air quality acceptance, right? So the only thing, it's very literal. It's just providing enough air, whatever this quality air, for people not to be bothered by odors. It says nothing about protecting people's health. Then we come to another more like a pressing issue. The assumption that kids are tiny adults, and this is not true. So kids are different because of behavior. They put more stuff in their mouths, they crawl around, they intake more of the dust that might be available and that might have pests and pesticides and whatever. Their defense systems are different. They are not fully developed. Think about even very important things like the blood-brain barrier, what protects all of us here from chemicals going directly in our brain. Well, for a kid, it's not as developed. Sorima, Emily know these chemicals that are bad for us, because of this sensitive window of exposure, are even worse for kids, right? So you have a situation where by design, we're not even providing for adults what they need, less so for kids. So I think just let's start from that point of view. And I think this is where the agendas of a community and a set of researchers come together, right? So we are in a situation where we have basically two types of issues, the very evident ones and the ones that are not so evident. But I think at the origin of these things is how to make these schools better, right? And I think it's from this partnership. First of all, identifying what would be the benefits from intervening in these schools and solving these issues, right? So if you think about, like, in very practical terms, there's an ROI. There's an ROI for intervening in schools. And we don't know that, right? So we can talk about maybe asthma is the one that is best developed, but we don't have a true return of investment from improving all these indoor environmental quality in schools. I think that's where we should be headed, right? So, but one by one, solve these issues, approach them systematically and through the lens of research, and document what are the benefits in terms of respiratory outcomes, what are the benefits in terms of physical fitness, what are the benefits in terms of absenteeism, presenteeism, cognitive function. The keynote speaker here, Professor Kippen, will tell us some stuff about CO2. Very important to schools. So how do we actually get at that point where we say, if we invest this much in schools, which I think for many of us it's almost intuitive, there's going to be a very positive ROI, right?
Yeah. I think hopefully, I was kind of hoping that the CO2 thing would be the easiest or or best way to do that, only because from what I'm seeing is what it looks like is it's about executive function, which I was an educator originally, so a lot of studying in childhood development and cognition and things like that. And you know, the highest order of cognitive function is executive functioning. And if you're supposed to be an institution of education, which is what public education is supposed to be for our kids, and if you found out that there was this thing floating around in the air that lowered your executive function, that you would think that that would be a really, like, it's like an easy story to tell. Like, trying to look for something that's easy, because we're talking about why don't people know about this stuff. We need to make these stories easy enough for regular people to understand this. We're not all scientists, you know? So something like that story of like, CO2, we all know what that is. It's the same stuff that's outside, that's the problem. As a matter of fact, when we go inside, it's a problem too, but in a school, isn't that just ironic that in a school where you're supposed to be reaching that highest cognitive function, there's a part of the building that's stopping that from happening. I was just hoping that over the next 10 years or so that could be a narrative that we all latch onto. I'll stay hopeful about it, I'll just say that.
I'll ask Nikki, because we've been talking about doing this type of studies in schools, but it's not an idea that is well received necessarily, right? So, Nikki, tell us a little bit more.
So we're partnering with Steve and EOC to do, kind of get kids involved with their own classroom environments and the educators as well to build their own ventilation device, to use sensors, to take data and kind of take ownership of the space that they basically live in for 8 hours a day, 8 sometimes plus, depending on their after school or after program. So not to go all over and over and aboard, the problem has been you need to have people subjects, you need blood work, blood in your blood, you can test everything. But in the community, who's gonna have their child tested without the right information and the benefit? So this is where we're at with our parents. I believe, just like lead testing, parents were on board with testing their children and themselves. I'm hopeful that it'll be the same response for indoor air quality and their spaces and testing to learn more about cognitive and the best research for them.
We do have a question. Is that okay? Can we take a question? Sure.
Thank you. Marion with Sustainable Jersey City. I know that in New York City, the Bronx Center for Science and Math, which is a high school in an EJ area of Manhattan, is working very closely with Columbia University. There's a whole study on citizen science with the students and monitoring this. There's, Carolyn Holquist at Columbia University. I don't know if you've talked to her or worked with her, but there's a lot of research being done on the cognitive, the ADD and violence and aggression tied to indoor air quality, and it's an understudied component. And I'm just wondering what other universities and partners and cohorts you can work with to do, just like we saw what Newark did after watching what was happening in Flint, Michigan. Why can't we in New Jersey take a look at what's being done in other places where they are studying this and they are working with getting the kids, even in the grade schools and the elementary schools and the middle schools as well as high schools, really involved in their own science, citizen science projects, and then they take that and that builds on the next generation. Have you been working with other universities and other cohorts?
So I think Memo can answer that. We're starting out with this pilot program, and historically in communities of color, I would say, testing is a sore subject because of the past history. So in order to educate folk. We have to get people educated and the benefit of getting them tested because it's their bodies, their children.
I'm not talking about testing.
Oh, I get it, and I am aware of a study, but we're trying to build that in New Jersey, and trying to, and I don't have exactly any samples of all of the universities or other things that they're doing here in New Jersey, because we're starting out. So we're just trying to get interest in our schools for that. So I may not be exactly answering your question, but I know that Memo and his team have started some things.
Well, go ahead.
I just want to mention real quick, New Jersey is the standard for the nation. We're the only country, only state in the country that has a public employee OSHA standard for indoor air quality. It's health-based. Just to point out, like to look, not to challenge the comment, but about like looking afield for answers. Like, we are the answer here.
So does that apply to schools, the OSHA standard?
It only applies to the workers in the schools, and as long as they are public employees. So if we're in a charter school, for example, I have plenty of friends that were, it's very different. If you are a public employee in New Jersey, you are covered under the POSHA Indoor Air Quality Standard from 2007, which is not the strongest standard, but it is the only standard in the US right now that is a public employee health-based indoor air quality standard. And it's something that helped us a lot with the pandemic in keeping some schools, 3 of them in New Jersey, closed during the pandemic because they proved that they could not maintain adequate ventilation during an ongoing pandemic.
We have another question?
Oh, I just answering more directly to your question. I think there's a constellation of these approaches. I think it's very organic. There's the well-recognized lack of funding to intervene top-down. So what has happened is that these solutions come from bottom-up, right? And you have, first, the need to diagnose. So that's where the use of low-cost sensors is very helpful. People have taken just these things these issues in their own hands and document how the building ventilates, right? I would say the approach that we have with Nikki might be at a very nascent stage. You know, as any other project that EOC or other researchers have started with the community, it has to build trust. And I think we're at that stage, right? So first of all, how can we contribute to the community providing these tools? Making sure, I know, for example, Dr. Rob Lombard has done a lot of effort with him and his team, Fatima, I think she was here, to say, okay, this is the type of the type of measurement that you can take. What does that mean? What are the limitations of those measurements? And I think, just like Alan started this conversation, it starts with education, right? So we're starting, we are providing the kids, the teachers, a whole new level of understanding of what it means, carbon dioxide concentration, particulate matter concentration. The next frontier is once they develop this, I would say, STEM curriculum on the use of the sensors, on the data collection, on the interpretation of the data, on the knowing the implications of being exposed to those levels, then it comes, okay, then how are those affecting us? And that's where I think once you have passed all these barriers of trust, that the community will say, yes, let's engage and provide that information. I don't know how many years Colombia has been working with these school districts, but it takes a long time, and I think we'll have to do that here.
It's getting the data. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, this is Robert Hernandez from One Green Construction, West Orange. I have a question, it's a practical question. You know, I teach Calgary University. Every time that I go into the room, because of the winters, everything is sealed. And the board is marked with the markers, right? And I notice every time that I go there, I have to clean it. I don't use chemicals, by the way, because you know, you can use a spray, put it on the board, on the whiteboard, to erase it. But I decided to use water and toilet paper. That's what I use, right? spray it, clean it, and because it absorbs all the chemicals. I was wondering if there had been any testing on the effect of that particles that are falling, because I see when I go into the room and I clean the whiteboards, all the chemicals that are floating all around me when I'm doing it. So I'm wondering if there is any research that has been done on the closed environment of classrooms with all these chemicals. Thank you.
Yeah, so I have to admit, I don't know of any research study that has particularly addressed the issue of the markers, but there's a ton of evidence on at least the mix of things that are in school dust. Just a few years ago, I don't know if some of you remember, there was a big issue with PCBs, right? So they were used in many parts on the caulking of the building structure, and these basically were partitioned into the school dust, right? With known endocrine disrupting consequences. I would say there's evidence that in many cases the dust in schools is definitely not healthy. I think to your point, the practical question is how you do something about it. You just said one very simple way of reducing whatever is coming out of those markers just by not using a chemical and using a mechanical method of removing them, right, with water. I think we have to come to this set of guidelines and simple instructions that could make a difference. Many of us here in the room have done or have seen I would say it's now a movement on do-it-yourself air purifiers, right? I think that's another response to it, right? So we know that we have particulates coming from outside, those generated inside the building, and we need to get rid of it. Can we change our ventilation system? Maybe not. So students, teachers have created their own filters, and actually they have been proven to work as good, if not better, than filtration units, hundreds of dollars more expensive than these do-it-yourself solutions. So
yeah, real quick, hundreds of dollars cheaper than the air purifiers that were installed throughout New York City by Delos. For anybody that knows about this story, is a good tale to know about intervention on behalf of public health from private industry when they're trying to help, because those units were not simply HEPA units. Well, the other thing I want to mention though is about source control, because what you're talking about this isn't about outdoor pollution. This is about stuff that happens inside the school building, and whether it's a dry erase marker or what used to be chalk, or I don't know if anybody's ever hung out in a school building right after it closes and you watch what your custodian is doing and how much dust accumulates at the bottom of that broom at the end of one day, every day, when you've got 2,000 human bodies shedding hair and skin and clothing fibers into a building. That is a ton of dust, and that dust absorbs like little fuzzy balls of absorbing magic. It'll take any VOCs out of the air that happen to be, like if your custodial staff who isn't trained properly because they're a third-party company that doesn't get trained, doesn't know how to really use their materials properly, and they off-gas a lot in a poorly ventilated environment, all that stuff gets absorbed into the dust. And if that dust accumulates, whether it's a dry erase marker or anything, it's the accumulation of that dust that creates an indoor environmental health problem. And we need to have enough staff, custodial staff, which that's why I get back to the idea of maintenance workers' rights and labor rights. It doesn't really seem like, I only learned this as I work for the Work Environment Council, but it doesn't seem like the two are necessarily related, but they are so related. We need to make sure that the custodians that work in your building, you're going to do the best you can, but you're only going to get so much. And we could teach these kids to learn what the exposures are. There's only going to be so much. You've got to have custodians in the building to clean up after them too, and so that this dust doesn't accumulate over time. So I just wanted to mention, to take it back to the labor side and the custodian, you know, where the custodian, you know, this isn't $500 air filtration equipment. Like, this is a human body. That's a worker, and like that's as old school technology as it gets. But they're like, we can't overlook that.
Okay, let's do this. We have 7 minutes. Actually, we have 6 minutes. Let's talk about solutions and hope and maybe what you guys are taking action on.
I see a raising hand in the back. I don't know if I don't want to disrupt the nice flow.
Yeah, and I think my point actually gets to the transition you're making, Carrie, which is I think this topic, there's actually potential for a lot of power to harness the passion that high school students and teenagers have, I think particularly in this generation, and their parents, right? Parents are like a really powerful force. We care so much about our kids, and all we want is for their health and well-being. And so I think as you get to the point where you feel like you have enough evidence to start saying we need to do something about this, let the kids be the voice, right? So in our school district, for instance, there was an issue that came up this year, and I was amazed at how passionate these teenagers got. They did sit-ins, they did walkouts, they created podcasts. So if you can leverage that collective power to make an impact on air quality in the schools, like, take advantage of these kids. They're smart, they're motivated. So I think that's like a resource to tap into.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and this is what part of our program is, getting our students involved. But it also starts with educating ourselves, using all of the information that we have. I am still learning. It's amazing that I know it was said about earlier, and I can't remember which panelist mentioned this, but I think it was you, Emily, sorry, that we're still involved in our day-to-day, that we don't get the information of basic things that are, and we know dry erase markers are like the odors and the particles are there, but do we know the details and what makes them dangerous? What are the solutions? We're not immediately thinking of solutions except, well, yeah, you use water, but on a day-to-day thing, it's hard. So part of the job that I have is part of educating. As our coalition, we're over 120 members, collated all of that information, and still counting. People are still getting involved. With all of that knowledge, with all of those groups, there are opportunities for students, parents, and community to get involved. So, but also the bottom line is funding. So that is also what I do. Funding, lobbying to legislators, and showing the importance of IAQ in schools.
Well, I'll answer directly to Emily's question with an example, because she was instrumental in putting me in touch with a school district that basically wanted to do this, right? A high school that wanted to improve their indoor air quality and do it as a science project, a 2-year science project. So they were very, very precise in what they wanted to achieve. There's this, as I mentioned, this new movement on air filtration units created by the students. The issue is with the portable air filters. They are very noisy, right? So the last thing that you want in a classroom is more noise. There's enough of it. So these guys, their proposal is they team up with the kids that do robotics and the computer programming, and they are hacking the fans so that they can reduce the noise and not necessarily reduce the delivery of clean air, right? So it's their science approach to solving this specific problem, and I think it's huge. We know that the Boston Public Schools put air filtration units, like commercial units, in every single classroom. And when you look at the data, because they also install sensors in every single classroom, you see that the filters are turned off. And it's because of these. They are too noisy.
They're too noisy.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely, it's a great point.
But the students, to your point,
they know.
the students are solving it. It's not a major commercial a corporation that is tackling this issue. It's high school students.
And I think I'd just like to mention about sensor technology. I say that they break as if I'm saying like don't use them, but I think sensor technology is, I mean, anybody that reads just general science news, like that area is exploding. And I think that's just stupid not to take advantage of it when it comes to, if you want to get kids involved. Like, why doesn't every single classroom have, I won't say the name, but an indoor air quality monitor, like the one that everybody went out and bought after the wildfires that happened in New York? Why doesn't every single classroom have one of those, and whether it's a science classroom or not, and kids start to get used to looking at it, but better than that, like doing it themselves. You know, taking these readings, teaching them how to be scientists, take these readings 3 times a day. This is what we do to the teachers, what I train teachers to do. Don't just tell me something's wrong, give me good documentation about what's wrong, when does it happen, let's try to figure out why it happens. That's what we're doing with teachers, because teachers, like, they're in a union, we can go in there and talk to them, but with students, you know, they want to do this stuff. They want to use technology and keep track of it, and it's part of their curriculum. I don't see why not.
Carrie?
Yeah, we're done.
We're
At
past?
this point, I want to say thank you to the panel. It's a fabulous panel.